for this reception and for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm a little uncomfortable speaking to you because I came to India to learn. I came to try to understand more about the work of Prime Minister Modi and the transformation of India that is taking place under his governments. But when I met with the Prime Minister, he said what I should do is come up here. So I'm following his directions, and I'm hoping that I'll have a good experience, and I thank you all for giving me this chance. I'm a student of international policy and of what we in the United States would call strategy, which is how to manage the policies of a state to maintain its security and prosperity without, if at all possible, resorting to war or having war forced on you. And statecraft, which is how to organize and lead a society, a given society, in order to develop its resources and its political cohesion to meet pressing challenges both at home and abroad. And these are certainly days where we in the United States are having to think very hard about both of these issues. One of the things that I like to see, that I've seen in the India that is rising today, is brilliant examples of both Dr. Jaishankar and Prime Minister Modi have articulated in terms of both strategy and statecraft. That is, that the strategy that India is developing in the world of cooperating with other countries who are interested in preventing China, if I can say the word, from becoming too dominant in its own region, is a very solid one. It has brought India a great deal of credit and has created relationships with Japan, with Australia, with the United States, and we have also in the Middle East the I2U2. So India has become a real leader in diplomacy and regional policy. And this, I think, is something that we can, even internationally, is seen and widely recognized. Last week, I suppose Dr. Jaishankar was in Australia. The Prime Minister is, I believe, in the UAE today, in the Middle East. So Indian diplomacy has become extremely active and extremely effective. But the statecraft that we see, in some ways, is even more interesting than the strategy. That is, the ideas behind Prime Minister Modi's government and politics. And again, as a foreigner, it's not my job to take the side of one party in India or the other. And I've been very fortunate. I've also met with Mr. Rahul Gandhi, and I try to listen to all sides of India. It's not my business what you choose. It's my business to try to understand what you are choosing. But what I certainly have seen with Prime Minister Modi is an effort to bring together the traditional roots of Indian culture and society to create a sense of unity without blocking India's modernization. Indeed, this is the way, I think, in the Prime Minister's view, for India to be most successful with economic development. So even as he has looked to Indian traditions, and this wonderful department and this wonderful effort is clearly a part of that vision, the Prime Minister has also set very ambitious economic targets for India. That is, that it would become the third largest economy in the world during the next parliamentary term, and by 2047, the 100th anniversary of Indian independence, India would become a fully developed country. These are extraordinary. They're very ambitious goals. They will demand a great deal of Indian society. There will be many changes. Not all of the changes will be welcome. There will be social tensions that arise. And as far as I can see, what the Prime Minister believes is that by drawing on the deep wells of Indian culture, of Vedic science, of the roots of Indian society, this is the way that India can find the strength and the cohesion to embrace the opportunities and encounter the challenges that lie ahead. So as you can see, this is both strategy and statecraft. And that's why I am particularly interested in it, and why I am so grateful to the Prime Minister and Dr. Jaishankar for giving me such wonderful opportunities to study this phenomenon of great international importance. But I'd like to say more about how what you are doing in India has consequences that go far beyond India. In the first instance, for the Indian Ocean, the Indo-Pacific, but beyond that, for the peace of the world. And many of us in the United States, when we think about the future and we try to see how can we find a relationship with China that works without war, without constant threat of war, it's clear that the rising power of India is a key element of that. And let me try to explain why I think this way and give you some historical grounding for this. And I hope that will help us all reach an understanding of the role of a rising India in the world. Let's start with a statistic, and it's not a very nice statistic. In 1980, the GDP, the gross domestic product of India, was 65% of the GDP of China. In 2022, the GDP of India was only 17% of China. So it went from about 2/3 of China's GDP to less than 1/5 of China's GDP in those 42 years. Now, I would suggest to you that that growing gap is the root cause of the political instability in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific. Because if India today were still at that 65% level of China's GDP, none of us would be so worried about China, whether it was China's trouble on India's frontiers with occasional invasions. None of us would be so worried about only China gaining influence in Southeast Asia, in Thailand and Myanmar, Burma, and so on, because India would be there too. And from the standpoint of the United States, it would mean that Asia there would be a better balance of power without the United States having to be so engaged, right? But this is not about fighting a war between India and China. It's about India developing India's potential. And I would argue that that statistic, depressing as it is today, if we can reverse that or move toward reversing that, that is the road to peace in this part of the world and indeed in the world as a whole. Yes. Why did it happen? Well, India grew. It's just that China grew much faster. And what China did, in a sense, China caught the bus and India missed the bus. The bus was manufacturing for exports, and not manufacturing high-tech, very glamorous things, not in the beginning, but manufacturing concrete, steel, other things, using China's labor market, where there were many people happy to work for much lower wages than they would work in the West. so that China could produce goods very effectively. And, as to why this happened, I think there's several reasons. In the beginning, there was still the kind of socialist planning mentality that India had after independence. But in addition, there were problems, and we can see, by the way, the current government is working to remedy these, a lack of infrastructure. You cannot be a world-class manufacturing economy if you don't have good highways, if the electricity supply is not very regular. To manufacture silicon chips, you can't have any variations in the strength of the electricity supply. So China was able, because of the very, we can say, tyrannical power of the Chinese government, it's able to just push all of these things through. Another problem, by the way, was land. In China, if a foreign investor says, I would like to build an automobile factory, I need, 100 hectares of land, I need this, I need that, I need a highway. The local government says, okay, they look around, they find the land. If someone lives on the land, boom, they just move them aside. Maybe they pay them some money, but maybe not enough. Anybody who has to be bribed or anything like this, and we all know there is a lot of corruption in China. But the foreign investor sees nothing. The foreign investor writes a check to the local government. The land package is delivered with everything. So there were many reasons that China was able to pull this together. They also very effectively used the state banking sector to provide cheap credit. So there were many reasons why this gap opened up. Well, India's changing, and well, that's the goal. It's right. You can't. It took 40 years for this situation to develop. It's not going to go away in 4 years. But often in life, you don't have to solve 100% of the problem to enjoy some of the benefits. And so even if India can begin to close the gap, even if it has not reached all the way, things can be better. So we hope that, and also China has problems now. China's growth, I think, is going to be slower. But let me put some of this in a historical context to show why I think this isn't just a short-term thing. We have a China problem now. India will help the world solve the China problem, but then another problem will come, and we'll just go through this. I actually think the outlook is better than that, more positive. Because if we look at the history of the Indo-Pacific, the modern history of the Indo-Pacific, there's been one problem that has, or one condition that has shaped its development, speaking as I do as someone who studies geopolitics, international power, and these things. And it was uneven economic development. And it begins, the British are the first country to have an industrial revolution. And so this tiny island with a very small population suddenly has technologies and productive forces that the rest of the world, no one in the rest of the world can match. And so a tiny island with a tiny population is able ultimately to reach out and dominate. I think it controlled 1/4 of the world's population at its peak. And even beyond the countries that it controlled were countries like mine, the United States, where our banking system was really dominated by the British, and our investments were very much dominated by the British. The British then, and then followed as other European countries adopted the technologies of the Industrial Revolution. The French also come to Asia, begin to establish a large empire, and so on and so forth. All right, what happens next is Japan develops an industrial revolution and modernizes long before any other Asian country does it. And this was tremendous in Indian history. Japan's development was a great moment because it says, we Asians can do this. It's not magic, it's something we can do, and we can study from Japan how we can put ourselves on an equal footing. However, because Japan industrialized while, say, China had not, two things happen. One is that Japan now has the military and industrial ability to invade and conquer most of China and much of the rest of Asia during its course. But also, like the British, the Japanese have a kind of an imperialistic mindset in this period. Our power is so great, we must be better than the others. We must have a right. The Chinese, they are so inefficient and dirty, they cannot organize themselves. They need us Japanese to do it, much as the British thought of many of their colonies. All right? After the war, the Pacific War, it's the Soviet Union, not so much in South Asia, but in Eastern Asia, the Soviet Union, because of the war, because of Stalin's massive industrialization, was so strong that the rest of that part of the world was, again, the Soviet Union had immense ambitions, and these other countries, to preserve their independence, were forced to look for allies far away from Asia, like the United States. All right. So the Soviet Union then passes as the power, and it's China is the next country, which has the uneven development. And so in China today, you have a kind of an imperialistic mindset. They say we are smarter than other people, we are more powerful, we are richer than other people, we can set the rules, we can control the region, and we deserve to, because we are so much better than the rest. It is that same mindset that we saw in the British, we saw in the Japanese, and that caused immense suffering in this region before it could be changed. Now, the rise of India is different, because what the rise of India means is that now we can't just speak of one or two countries in Asia. We are now talking, it's a tipping point. It's a majority. And as India rises, we are seeing Vietnam is rising, right? We are seeing Indonesia is rising. So we are going to see now an Asia where the uneven development of the past is vanishing. And India is leading the process throughout Asia of the equalization of development in Asia and vis-a-vis the West, the North, however we want to put it. So this is a historic task and a historic moment. And if India succeeds in this, I think it means that people throughout the region are going to live a more peaceful and prosperous life. The various countries of the region will each be able to develop as their own culture and civilization would indicate. They'll be able to follow their own views. They'll be able to make their own lives. And then, there will be disagreements and quarrels. We are human beings, and we do these things. But we can also expect there will not be a single country, certainly not the United States and certainly not China, that is in the position to think that it can dictate to all of these countries what they should do, how they should live, what their priorities would be. Now, this is, unfortunately, because this gap exists, there is a military dimension to the work that we all need to do. We need to think about the common security, the balance of forces. We need to make sure that China, unlike Japan, is not tempted, or unlike the British, is not tempted to take advantage of weakness. Okay, we have to do that. But our goal is not war in this. Our goal actually is to keep the peace while India's development, the rise of India, makes war impossible and convinces the people, even in Beijing, you know what? China's a very big country. We have a very large economy. But Asia is bigger than we are. It is too big. If you go to Japan today, you don't hear people dreaming of conquering Asia, the East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They know this cannot be. They know that the world has changed and this is impossible. You can go to Britain and you don't hear them talking about, let's revive the British Empire. They know this is completely impossible. We need for Beijing to have this same realization and understanding that it is just not possible. So this is why I personally strongly hope and pray that India will continue to grow, that your policies will succeed, that India will play the role in the Indo-Pacific, Asia, and the world that I believe it is destined to play. And why I think this is good news not only for Indians, but for the entire human race. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, sir, yeah, you can ask some question. Sir, that is good. One thing that actually you pointed out, very important thing, that after independence, we on social information and all that, industrial development was blocking that part. And but I would like to say one thing, sir. After Second World War, 1946, and Japan was vanished almost. China present government, this left government, was in 1949, and India also became independent in 1947. But I feel personally, I am a student of science and you are the foreign affairs expert. So I feel personally, Japanese, they did the industrial revolution and they know there is no agricultural land that much, so we can go for development only through industry. Chinese have both things, agriculture sector also, and they have industry. I personally feel that Chinese follow the cheap market, cheap goods, industry, and they try to send the all the product to the European countries also, big market in India also they see. So that is the one reason for their economic development. And another thing is that India, if you see the after independence up to 15, first, second, third plan, the most of the GDP part was from the agriculture sector.
Yes.
We have seen the agriculture sector 65% of the GDP from agriculture and all. We have seen that green revolution in agriculture sector. We have seen that white revolution. But last 10 years or 15 years in Gujarat model, Modi ji started a kind of industrial revolution also, invited the industrialists from all over the world in the state and the country to give some land and all these things. They made the rules also very easy. And one of the things that our population growth rate is very positive, very high positive growth rate. But one thing is that most of the population is below 30. So one of the youngest country in the world. So with these things, I think we have a good chance for economic growth and GDP that our Prime Minister vision of to get the third position in GDP. I hope that we will achieve.
I also do.
Yes.
Hope very much.
Yes. Yes. So with this thing, sir, Dr. Sahi, sir.
Regarding China, we always think, of course, we know we always feel that it takes close and whatever it comes out is from the censor.
Mm-hmm.
How much do we want to inform?
I am.
And how really they should influence us?
Yes. No, it's really very sad what's happened in China. 10 years ago, I could go to China and have conversations with Chinese scholars and others just the same as I do here, where we're just two people speaking our minds. But today, they can't say anything. And we know that that the government statistics are completely unreliable. But we can measure that there is something there in two ways. One, you can go and you look at a city like Shanghai or Beijing. When I first went to Beijing in the 1990s, everyone was riding a bicycle. Now everyone's in a car. The roads were 2 lanes, they're 6. You can see a big difference. But also we measure it in terms of the size of Chinese exports to other countries and their imports of raw materials and so on. What we think is that China has systematically overestimated its GDP, maybe by 10%, but it's hard. It is hard to get a real number. We also have problems. If you follow the news, you know that their housing market, which is very important in the Chinese economy, the prices are going down. Developers are failing. They're having a huge problem there. So some of their GDP is measured in terms of the value of the houses, the apartments that they built. Well, what if those apartments are only half as much as they thought they were worth? It depends. It depends on the product and depends on the company that makes it. But there's certain sectors where China really does have very, very strong technology. And the problem, for example, you've banned Chinese apps in India. The problem with the Chinese apps isn't that they don't work as apps. It's that the Chinese can take the knowledge that's in the apps, the information that's in the apps. So in that sense, the problem is not that they're bad, it's that they're too good, too over-engineered in a way. So I think we cannot dismiss China's achievements. They're very real achievements. The bullet trains that they have that, you can get in a train in Beijing and you can take it to Shanghai or Chongqing. These are real achievements.
6-hour journey.
But at the same time, they have made, and their one-child policy has been a disaster. They are now facing perhaps a population crash. People now think the United States could pass China's population by the end of the 20th century. So, things have changed. We don't know how it's all going to work out. And because I once, in the 1990s, I actually spent a lot of time with Fidel Castro. I was working on U.S.-Cuba relations at that time. And Castro, I have to tell you, he was I disagreed with him about just about everything, but he was a brilliant man. He certainly understood Cuban politics. But he did have a pattern of making bad decisions. And I remember one afternoon I was with him and a group of Cubans, and he just started telling the most boring stories, on and on and on. And they weren't important, they weren't interesting. It was like your grandfather, blah, 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 blah. Right? Or my students would say, like our professor. Anyway, he kept telling these stories, and he looked around the room at one point, and he said, "Am I talking too much?" And all the Cubans said, "No, Fidel, tell us more." Right? I imagine Xi Jinping has the same problem. No one will tell him the truth. It's one of the reasons I think for all of its faults, democracy is a good thing, that there's always somebody there to tell you, you're talking too much. Yes? Yes. Well, I think what India has been doing with information technology is terrific and has been really played to India's strengths. I think actually the success of Indian high-tech companies helped build Indian confidence. I can remember when I first started coming to India maybe 30 years ago, many Indians had the attitude that poor India can't really compete in the world. The rules are against us and so on. I even once asked a friend, I said, why can't India and America get along better? We just want to trade with you. We don't want to conquer you. He looked at me, he said, that's what the British said. We just want to trade with you. And so there was this feeling that if India really engaged with the world, India would lose somehow. The others would make India fail. After the success of Indian high tech, there is much less of that feeling. Indians believe we can beat world competition. We can do the most difficult things as well or better than anybody else. All right, and so that's great. But I'll say this, the jobs that IT makes, and they're good jobs, but they're mostly for people who speak English. They're mostly for people who have a pretty good educational background. India also needs to do something for the people who don't speak foreign languages, who don't have the advantages of coming to a school like this. The beautiful thing about manufacturing, even manufacturing very low value things, is it gives jobs for these people. It gives them a chance to escape the poverty of the land. And you know, with each generation, it's harder to live on the land. The land gets divided among more children, and it creates poverty. There has to be a place for people to go. And this can't be a call center. It can't be a high-tech environment. There has to be something. And so working on the manufacturing jobs for the ordinary person. This is not long-term, because the day will come when the robots take all of those jobs, but not yet. And so I think India has one more chance, because everyone is now thinking it's not safe to depend on China as a source of manufacturing. So a lot of investment that used to go in China is looking for another home. And Bangladesh is saying, well, what about me? Vietnam is saying, what about me? India needs to be there saying, what about me? That's what I think.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, I won't say anything about what we discussed. That's not how that works. But I will say that I find him to be someone who thinks very deeply about the problems of India, and who is very much has his mind on the inclusion. He understands that you cannot simply grow for the top. You have to grow for the nation as a whole.